Hi, Professor Stanley here, and today we are going to talk about an EOD. A lot of you may be wondering what an EOD is and what it stands for. It stands for an emergency order of detention. And while it isn't really an order of detention because no judge has signed off on it, most of us call it that in the psychiatric world. And it just means that a patient is determined to be a danger to themselves or others and cannot leave the psychiatric facility. In the state of Oklahoma, 120 business hours is the length of an emergency order of detention. I realize most books will tell you that it is 72 hours, but it does vary by state law and from state to state. So you may wonder just how a person comes to be in a psychiatric facility. Many people come to psychiatric facilities because they are having suicidal thoughts, and they will often go to their emergency room, and a physician or a licensed provider will determine that they are a danger to themselves. It is always good to admit someone to a psychiatric facility if they are having suicidal thoughts, even though it may not feel good to them at the time. Hopefully they can get some help and these thoughts can start to go away. Although not quite as common, people are also admitted for homicidal thoughts because they are a danger to others. And when this occurs, the 120 business hours will still apply, as the physician will need this time to evaluate them to see if they are a danger to themselves or to others. My next fellow that may be admitted to a psychiatric facility under an EOD is a person who has thought distortions. They may have hallucinations or delusions, such as my fellow in the photo who believes that he is king of the world. Because of this, it may make them a danger to themselves because they're not able to make good basic safety decisions, as their thoughts are not normal and not centered in reality. Now, it's important to remember that when they are put into a psychiatric unit under an EOD, they are often held against their will, and the weekends don't even count in the 120 business hours. So that's an important thing to remember because it can be very traumatic for patients. So you may be wondering what happens after the 120 hours is up if the patient is still a danger to themselves or others. The problem is that if a patient is still dangerous to themselves or others, a doctor must then make a decision to take them before a judge. And nobody wants that because of the fact that when a patient is taken before a judge, then they wind up being court committed to treatment on the unit. And when they are court committed to treatment, then they lose the right to be able to make choices about medications and what they want to take and even when they want to leave. And so it is very important that if you are a nurse who is working in a psychiatric facility and you have a patient who is very sick, that you take the time to provide proper documentation so that if it does go before a court, that the determination may be made that the patient is too sick to be on their own and has to receive treatment. This is only done in the most extreme of cases and is not very common at all, but it is important that we do what we need to do to make sure that patients leave our facility and are safe once they leave the facility. So you may wonder just how a person comes to be in a psychiatric unit anyway. Usually someone comes into the psychiatric unit through the ER and are brought in by police or an ambulance after either a suicide attempt or because someone calls the police and says to them, I'm worried about my friend. Could you please go do a welfare check on them or something of that nature? When they do get to the emergency room, they will be evaluated by someone who is a licensed mental health provider. That usually means a therapist or a social worker, sometimes a nurse or a physician as well. And that person issues an LMHP statement, which functions in the place of an EOD until such a time as that patient actually goes to court. So basically, that statement will allow that patient to be held because the person is declaring on their license that that person is a danger to themselves or others. Now, I will also mention that many times patients come into the psychiatric unit and they'll say, I just had a bad night, I drank too much. And while we realize that happens and some people may not really have suicidal thoughts, we still have to treat every patient the same way and hold them for a period of evaluation to make sure that they aren't suicidal in order to do our due diligence as a provider of care in a psychiatric facility. The licensed mental health provider who is issuing the LMHP statement that says that a patient is a danger to themselves or others and requires hospitalization in a psychiatric facility will do it based upon several possible factors. One might be a third-party statement, and for example, the person who has called the police saying that they're worried about their friend or called an ambulance, they might make a statement saying that they received a text or they found a suicide note or something of that nature. Or even the police might show what they've observed, and that statement itself may be a third-party statement. Suicidal statements or suicidal ideations or suicide attempts can all be justification for admission to a psychiatric facility. Also, homicidal statements or homicidal intentions towards someone else and acts such as going and buying a firearm after making a statement might be something that would cause them to be admitted to a psychiatric facility. Another reason a person might be admitted would be from observations that occur within the healthcare setting or by others. For example, if a patient were very psychotic and they were doing things that showed that they were out of their head, then they might have an LMHP statement based upon observations that would be issued. It must be justified in order for a patient to be admitted into a psychiatric facility. It is not just done arbitrarily. So let's talk about finances for a minute. You know, the inpatient psychiatric facility is the most expensive level of care for psychiatric patients. And unfortunately, for many of our patients, they suffer a great deal in the community because they don't meet the criteria of suicidality or homicidal thoughts. Only Medicare will pay for their patients to be able to come in to have a medication adjustment. And some people really suffer even though they need psychiatric admission, they just can't get it. Other private insurance companies refuse to have any patients inpatient unless they are very, very ill and a danger to themselves or others. And they even drive the length of stay, causing hospitals to sometimes discharge patients before they really should be discharged. EMTALA regulations also demand that hospitals treat patients who show up at the ER and they say that they're suicidal or homicidal. And in many cases, this has caused some patients to work the system and to pretty much live inpatient. And it keeps people from who really need help sometimes from getting beds. So this is some problems with our system the way that it is now. I will leave you with this final thought. Anytime that we restrict someone's autonomy, it is a very serious matter. Patients are brought into the psychiatric unit not because they've committed a crime, but because they're sick. And the truth of the matter is that we are not jailers as psychiatric nurses, and it is a very serious thing to restrict someone's autonomy. And as Americans, especially who value our freedom, it can be very difficult for patients, and we need to have a lot of compassion and empathy for them. This is Brandy Stanley, and I would like to thank you one last time for listening to my presentation, and I hope that you found this information helpful.